We're talking about campaigns and elections and political parties. So we just covered that the fact that money buys a lot in terms of media time during elections. Generally, parties use negative campaign ads because they actually increase information. You think, well, read it in the book, but really, money is used to motivate people to come and vote, and fundraising is going to discourage challengers. But let's talk about this. Can campaign contributions be regulated? This is a really interesting question because a lot of people say political parties are so powerful because they have so much money and elections cost so much, nobody can really run because of all the big money. Well, a variety of Supreme Court hearings have said you can restrict contributions but not on spending, but really, the Supreme Court has ruled that a dollar is the same as a voice. So money equates to free speech, and some reforms in the judicial system have set limits on campaign finance reform. But what has happened is it's called the growth of super PACs. We get nonprofit organizations that have a social welfare function. In other words, they're to advocate for a specific issue. And contributions to those groups cannot be regulated, and their contributions to media ads aren't regulated. So what will happen is you'll have a candidate who cannot work with a super PAC. They can't coordinate their efforts. So we have campaign contributions limited to individual candidates, but the candidate might have a part of their platform something like environmental issues. And so we get a nonprofit organization that advocates for environmental issues, and they can spend an unlimited amount of money advocating for candidates who are pro-environmental issues. Now, they can't coordinate. The campaigns can't send money that way, and they can't accept money from those people, and they can't talk about which issues to talk about. But essentially, nonprofits called super PACs can spend as much money as they want, even if we do regulate how much money campaigns themselves can spend. So presidential elections have two stages. First, they're nominated, and then they win. Then they have to run off in a general election. So what happens is that parties have different rules for selecting nominees, but we get party candidates who have widely different perspectives than what the general population wants. So in a nominating campaign among all the Republicans fight for who's going to win the presidency. But on an ideological spectrum, they only have to win the middle voter. So the middle ideological preference of the Republicans, that's the one they have to win. So you could have a really, really conservative Republican or a more liberal Republican winning. Most of the time it's more conservative. But when they have to compete against like a Democrat in a general election, you don't have moderates fighting against each other. You have really people who can win the middle in the Republicans and people who can win the middle in the Democrats. The problem is that's not where the middle of the U.S. is. The middle of the U.S. is actually more like liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. But because we have to nominate them in that nominating convention and then they have to fight in a general election, we don't have moderate presidential candidates. Now, the Electoral College determines the general election winner, and we've seen a bunch of states change their rules about how those are won, how those electoral votes are won. So when we actually vote inside the state, we don't vote for the president. We actually vote for a person who will vote for the president in the Electoral College. This was all part of the founders' idea of how to slow down democracy. So each state gets to choose whether or not they allocate all of their votes to the person who won that state. So let's say in one state, Hillary Clinton would have won 51% of the popular vote and Donald Trump won 49%. Does the state have to give all of their Electoral College votes to Hillary Clinton, or can they split it? Well, each state gets to choose that. And there's always this risk of, even if we say in California we wanted to vote for like Hillary Clinton, that the people who go to the convention in the Electoral College, they might not actually vote for Hillary Clinton because they're called faithless electors. There's always that risk. So there's been a movement to try and get a president directly elected, but they have to fight against these long-standing constitutional problems of the fact that the Electoral College is how we choose the president. And each state gets to determine how that electoral college is chosen. And they get to state those state rules. Remember, founding. How this all came about really matters. So, generally a plurality is only needed for each state, sometimes a majority because of runoff. Certain states have different rules. There's all sorts of these different ways in which we represent interests. But when we start thinking about how do we get people's preferences into elected offices, parties end up being really important, because the party in power during the census determines how the state gets to redraw its electoral districts. You think, well, that's a dumb thing to really think about. This is actually where the rubber meets the road in elections. Not just turnout, but who turns out for which seat in which area. So as we start drawing these lines of how each person is represented, or each area is representative, we get this problem of gerrymandering. The House has 435 members. At each census, they determine how many of those members are elected from how many districts in each state. Read about it in the book. Essentially, like California, we have over 50 that go to the House. House is based on population, right? Well, that means we've got to draw 50 separate electoral districts inside the state of California. Now, that number is not exactly right. It's not exactly 50, and it goes up and goes down based on every 10 years we have a census, and the census tells us how many people are in each state and where they're allocated. So we look at the whole population of the United States, divide that more or less by 435, figure out which, where we round and we cut off, and we allocate certain seats or House seats to each state. And then the state says, well, now we've got 50 electoral districts. How do we divide that up? Well, they get to draw those districts. And the party in power in the state, most of the time, gets to draw those districts. And they have an incentive to draw them in such a way that they can win elections. That's called gerrymandering. It's a long story. It's a good story about drawing a district to favor a guy named Jerry. Anyway, and the mander it comes from a salamander, because the first district looked like a salamander, so they called it gerrymandering. Anyway, so every party in every state gets to draw these districts, more or less, to make them look like where they can win elections. Now, when that happens, that means that it's easier for those parties to win elections in those states. So a couple of crucial things. The census is really important because it counts and allocates House seats to each state. The state party in power then gets to draw how those districts are drawn up. They get to draw the boundaries. They draw them in such a way that they can win the elections. Now, there's some rules about how that happens, like it's got to be racial and ethically diverse. It's got to follow historical, communities. It can't divide people up in certain different ways. But really, this is how parties win elections over a long period of time. In fact, the Republicans have won massive elections that they probably shouldn't have won if we looked at popular votes, because they were in power during these elections that occur around the 10-year mark, when the census data comes back and they start drawing new districts. So another way in which parties matter is that if you're in power, it's easier to stay in power. That's called incumbency. Incumbency means that you have an advantage when you go up to against another opponent. Think about this. Most people who are in power can use the resources in power to show what they've done. But everybody who fights against them in terms of an election, they have to say, this is what I'm going to promise. They have no record to really fall back on. So most people who are elected to Congress get reelected. You can look at those data right there, 85 and 90% in the House, 80% in the House. Most people who come into the House succeed in a seat or in an election where there's not an incumbent. Incumbents usually win because they get free media, they have existing connections, they have party support, they have name recognition, and most challengers don't have that. So when we engage in politics, when we vote, when we participate in political parties, that's called political participation. Civic engagement, when we vote, when we volunteer to work for candidates, when we contact elected officials, when we organize outside election, that actually really matters a lot. Now, people have to vote in order to participate in representative democracy, and voting is really, really crucial to that. But most Americans don't vote. We're really bad at it. And actually, when you start looking at how parties in power try to win elections. We talked about gerrymandering, but one of the ones that we don't really talk about in the book very well is that states have passed laws discouraging people from voting. They made it harder for people to register to vote, harder for people to turn out. Some things that make it easier, like motor voter laws, where you can register and vote on the same day, where you can submit a provisional ballot. If you're not in the place where you normally vote, you can submit a ballot in a different jurisdiction. Maybe where you have to go vote is somewhere different than where you live, and that's hard to get there. Mail-in ballots make it easier for people to vote. There's all sorts of things that also impact who votes. People who generally don't have IDs or lower income people, largely minority status, have a harder time getting places. People who believe that their vote doesn't matter generally don't turn out to vote. Older people generally turn out to vote. Females generally turn out to vote. Strong party attachment tends to bring people to vote. But turnout is what matters. We can talk about that. Felons have been disenfranchised. There's all sorts of rules about registration. People don't show up to the elections that actually matter the most. Like city council elections, your vote has a higher impact in smaller elections than it does in larger elections because there are fewer people in those elections. So your vote actually matters more, but people turn out to them less. Nevertheless, all of this stuff brings us to a couple things. Political parties organize politics. They organize governing. They organize recruitment and support for political candidates. They encourage people to turn out. People have tried all sorts of different ways to encourage turnout. Parties matter because they govern, but also they get to redistrict and they get to gerrymander. There's all sorts of ways, but that elections matter and that political parties matter. A lot of the stuff is covered in your book, but I need you to understand that turnout is actually probably the biggest driver of whether or not parties win. It's not necessarily the strength of the political party itself, but the strength in which they can exert on individuals to show up and to become engaged. All right, those are political parties and elections.